Welcome to Beyond BIM. In today's episode, we dive deeper into the field of architecture. I sat down to discuss the state of architecture with Laurie Chetwood. Laurie is an innovative artist and designer. He has both colorful ideas and a radical vision for architecture. I have had the personal pleasure of working with Laurie in my own career and have always known him to follow not the traditional route when it comes to thinking about design and its impact on human well-being. He believes in questioning convention and taking risk, as well as embracing creative adventures that combines the concepts of sustainability and the impact on human well-being. And specifically, that by unleashing the unexpected and pushing what's possible, true advances in the architectural field can be made. But as we know, for many architects, this might not always be as straightforward to implement. Architects on a whole have received both praise and much criticism. More recently, perhaps, a more unified voice of praise than true criticism. We discuss contentious topics such as whether beauty really is in the eye of the beholder when it comes to architecture. Laurie reminds us that now is the time for creative risk-taking in architecture. Timing is everything with risk, and perhaps now is the time to embrace human responsiveness and well-being in spaces. To hear more on this and beyond, let's listen to what Laurie has to say on the state of architecture and the much-needed shift in the architectural creative process. First and foremost, could you, Laurie, tell us a little bit more about yourself and what led your career path into the world of architecture in the first place?
Yeah, sure. I'm an architect. I own a practice which has been going for about 30 years or so. And originally, I was heavily into art. I enjoyed art and I enjoyed the freedom it gave and everything else. Unfortunately, when I suggested art to my dad, who was a dyed-in-the-wool building contractor, he was vaguely horrified that I might become an artist and suddenly switched to me, suggesting to me that I should be an architect. Interesting that he'd actually sort of said how awful architects were throughout my childhood, and the fact he had to deal with them on a daily basis. I found that a little ironic, but so it was really, I was steered away from art and towards architecture, but I've never really lost the desire to bring more art into my architecture, and I wonder whether perhaps I should have stuck with art sometimes. In this profession, it's one of the most frustrating professions.
Or an artist, you mean?
Well, an artist, you see, has this sort of freedom. Okay, people might not like what you do, but it's down to you. You can do things with impunity, and it just happens. You haven't got hundreds of stakeholders telling you what to do or suggesting what you should do. Particularly unqualified stakeholders drive me mad in architecture. Whereas with art, if you don't like it, tough really. I like it, and that's it. And you don't quite have the same freedom in architecture. So I come from that art background, to answer the question, and I'm trying desperately to get some of that art into architecture, which I think it sort of sadly misses at the moment.
Now, you mentioned that obviously you were pulled by the side of art. What was it about, you mentioned freedom, but what were the aspects that really drew you into the artistic and creative side?
Well, I think it's a natural thing. A lot of people say, I can't draw or I can't paint. I don't think it is that. I think the actual art, or the act of art or drawing or painting, is practice, actually. I don't think anybody's better or worse than that. It's just that when you're young, if you like it, you do it more often, and therefore you get better at it. And it's almost the same with anything. Obviously, the ideas that come with it are something you're born with, almost an instinctive idea. But technically, it's easier to do something if you've done it a lot. And literally, when you're a young kid, you're obviously drawn to certain things that interest you, and art is something I've always done, and it's a sort of it's inherent, that particular desire to do it. I think that's where it comes from. But it is a practice thing, and then it's ideas after that. But that's where I've got it, I think. Both my grandfather and my father, actually, although he was a contractor, were very good at art. And I suppose it comes through in the genes eventually.
So you then transitioned into your professional career, which was in architectural domain. So if you were to describe your approach to architecture, do you have a singular approach that underscores your work? So you often embrace inspiration from nature and beauty. Could you explain further this type of approach in your work? And are there any other singular methods that you try and stick with?
Yeah, I like the natural history side of things, always have outside architecture. So I always used to watch natural history programs. I was interested in birds and all that sort of thing. And it's sort of that particular natural, organic side of things has really interested me. And on the converse side, I don't really like the intellectual, dogmatic, formulaic approach to architecture. I think it's been great for a certain length of time. Socially, it was necessary at the end of the last century, but I'm talking about the beginning of the 20th century. But it doesn't, for me, appeal to the human nature or human spirit. I like things that are natural and things that the human being desires. I think to some extent the public have sort of been left out of the architectural debate, and they're sort of having to put up with whatever we produce, almost inured to the fact that you get architecture sort of given to you and imposed upon you, where I think people should. It's a bit of a contradiction, really, because too many people getting involved in too many solutions sometimes becomes counterproductive. But we should be taking into account what people truly want, and I think that, for me, is more about human nature, human spirit, than some sort of dogmatic formula that we all seem to have been touting for the last 100 years or so. It's an intellectualized idea, which I think lacks that warmth, that human. That need for the human nature and human spirit as a content.
So the projects that you've worked on till now, can you give us some examples of your most fun projects that embrace this type of approach that you've just described? One that is responsive to the human needs, one that embraces nature.
Do you know what? I think we're a commercial practice. We're responsible for keeping livelihoods going after a certain time. We were set up in a time when the economics of the situation, i.e. there was a slump at the time. We needed to get something on the table for families and everything else. And it turned into a commercial outfit. So a lot of what we do is making sure that we're doing things efficiently, on time, to the right budget. So there aren't many things I can honestly put my hand up and say, Laurie, you have followed the principles of your original ideas, which are instinctive and more to do with the human spirit. There aren't many. I suppose the main one would be actually the house that we built for ourselves as a family in Dunsfold, the Butterfly House. It just shows you actually that if you're in control of the project to some extent, you've reduced the number of stakeholders and you are able to do something that truly you stand for. That was the one that really stood out for me. It has all the ingredients for a young family to be brought up in. It was fun. It was all about the life cycle of a butterfly. So it had the more natural sort of side of things that I was quite interested in. And it was experimental. So it was definitely not formulaic. It was trying to push the boundaries of design in a certain particular way, from the furniture that we had inside the house to the exterior. And that was probably one of the few things where I thought, well, actually, that is me. And most of the other schemes are going to be distorted by money and all the other things I've already mentioned. It's sort of more practical things. So, that's probably the best one I can think of.
So that would be the Butterfly House.
Yes.
Yes.
It's sort of It's an existing house that was built for the Ideal Home exhibition, funnily enough, as an exhibition kit building for the Ideal Home exhibition before the Second World War. All timber, cedar, and it was rebuilt out in Surrey for a family to live in the summer, I think. And we weren't allowed to knock it down. So it's on a nice piece of land looking over the Sussex border. And we altered it in such a way as to obviously preserve the building, but then put a lot of other things around it. So and it was all according to the life cycle of butterflies. So arrival was the sort of very early stages of pupa and eggs and so forth. And then you got in through to the middle of the house, a chrysalis type situation. So some of the hanging furniture with these chrysalis type forms. And then there's an explosion of energy right in the heart of the building, which was then epitomized by this huge wing on the front, which kept the sun off the southern facing elevation. And that opened and shut, was able to open and shut. And it was a sort of, it was great because it was completely different at the time. It was the early 2000s, and it certainly wasn't a formulaic sort of boiled dry modernist idea. It was much more organic, and it did frighten the neighbours to some extent, but generally it went down pretty well. It won a few awards and a few plaudits, although it was different. And we're looking at it again, funnily enough, as a place. We've still got the place, and we're now looking at it a completely different way, whereby the architecture disappears, and we reform this as a sort of refuge, hopefully, for people to go there and repair or make of it what they will. And the architecture itself, it disappears, becomes anonymous almost, so that it doesn't impose itself on people who go and live and work and play there. It leaves this human being to work out what is there, rather than have some architect coming along with a bit of an ego, which I admit that was a bit of an ego building originally. Rather than having somebody impose the architecture on one, you actually get this space which you can now decide what you make of it. That's the plan anyway.
You mentioned that the original butterfly house was built in 2000. Now, if you compare that time to where we are now, do you think there's more of an appetite for these types of experimental spaces, or less so?
I think it is becoming more experimental at long last. I still worry that if you put a sort of a really good piece of modern architecture on the front cover of a 1930s magazine, that you wouldn't really tell the difference. In other words, what was being done in the 30s, say for a house, could easily be represented on a magazine today, and people wouldn't bat an eyelid. If you put a 1930s car on a magazine cover, you'd be thinking you were looking at a classic car mag. So it's a sort of, I think architecture is sort of, it's a bit behind the times. And I think people are beginning, certainly the younger practitioners are beginning to come up with much more experimental stuff. But of course, and I think we need to sort of get away from that horrible time and money sort of cycle. And I think it is beginning to change, largely because there are a couple of drivers that are pushing it this way. I think well-being is a big one. And also the environmental arguments are becoming quite important. So I think those two elements will drive clients and developers and local authorities to start embracing slightly more experimental ideas which change the course of the normal route, which I maintain a lot of architecture is what I would call lazy architecture. It's so easy to do a very rectilinear modernist approach, which without much thought, we know it's going to be cheap or more cost effective as it stands at the moment. And we know people are going to think it's quick. It probably is. And that has always been a bit of an impasse, I think, in why architects should take into account people more than the project managers of this world. We as architects should start considering people and well-being and the environment, and hopefully by pushing ideas further in that direction, developers and everybody else will begin to embrace that more readily. We have a responsibility, in other words.
So these two areas that you just covered, which is well-being and sustainability, do you think these two can work in harmony, or do you see that perhaps in one instance, for example, sustainability might limit the ability to be creative and playful in a way that does have an impact on well-being.
Yes, there is a good point there. There is a worthiness about sustainability, and it's almost as though you've got to suffer to actually be sustainable. I don't think it's necessarily true. I think there are plenty of reasons why you can make that fun and enjoyable. And I think that beating everybody up and almost wagging the finger isn't the right way to do this. So I agree with you on that. I think, and the well-being thing is sort of similar. If you follow the rules that you're just simply getting people to engage, to collaborate, to enjoy, the well-being part is is quite a good one to look at. And I think the psychology of the briefs that we get aren't good enough often. You're not really exploring the subject well enough. You've got to really go into quite a lot of detail and depth before you start designing, I think, these days, if you're going to take people into account.
You did mention a little bit about style and how architectural style these days doesn't really seem to follow the pace as what we're seeing in other sectors. Do you think that in architecture, beauty is still in the eye of the beholder?
Well, I've got yes, it's one of my beefs, actually. Beauty, is in the eye of the beholder up to a certain point. You could probably, in my opinion, say 60% of things are naturally beautiful, and you could say a fair proportion are naturally ugly. And then there are people who find beauty in ugliness and ugly in beauty and all that sort of stuff. But generally speaking, most human beings would say that's lovely and that's not lovely. And therefore, I think there's a lot of pretentious stuff about making something ugly look beautiful or pretend it is. And it's sort of I think the emperor's clothes come in here, where people are pretending or intellectualizing things and saying, oh, these are brilliant, I like this a lot. But actually, is it? And I think there is a website knocking out around somewhere that, am I the only person thinking this? You scratch your head and you think, come off it, crikey. But I'm not sure if anybody ever dares to say so. And certainly that's definitely the situation with architectural magazines. They quite rightly have to make sure that they get the right sort of material into their magazines, but it's very rare there's anything critical of anything that comes from the upper echelons of the architectural profession. It's always just liked, and it's not always good. And I think that's another area of concern, that I think we should be a little bit more honest about some of the buildings we put up. I do get the impression that the public generally are inured to architecture, and they just think, I've just got to put up with this. That's what it is, and it's imposed upon me. And I just think we, as a profession, should start to take responsibility for that and start to change things if we possibly can.
So does that mean, in one sense, that the subjective experience of a building or a space may not be as subjective or personalized as one might think?
Yeah, that's what I think. I think often architects, because we're all creative and we like to make a statement and make a mark, it's often at the expense of the people who are actually working or living or playing in the building. And I do think it's sometimes a bit of an ego trip. Surely there's something in leaving the architecture as being quite passive and letting somebody who's using the building make of it what they will. There must be something in that, a much more neutral idea that awaits the inhabitants rather than the other way around. You tend to turn up and that's a very strong color, that's a very strong shape, this is the concept, something that is intellectualized, which it happens in a lot of areas. It leaves the very people who are using the building behind, and it works for all the architects who understand how it works, and maybe various professors in various institutes understand, but do the people who actually go into the building understand what's going on? It's a bit like, you get some really, really contemporary classical music, which is a complete load of nonsense to most people, but people who have understood classical music for a long time and they understand it, but it's a very narrow field. And I think that's sort of irresponsible in architectural terms anyway. We have to include people in our designs, that's for sure.
Well, you've experienced the changes within the architectural industry throughout when you started out until today and what we're witnessing now. And there seems to be every now and then sort of paradigm shifts based on what's happening around us in the world. How would you describe that the architectural practices have changed over recent years in their creative approach, or would you argue that they haven't?
Well, I would initially have answered the latter. I think we're stuck. But you do see this throughout history. You see certainly in the arts anyway, certain things sprint ahead, if you like, from others. So, the 17th, 18th century, you see landscape suddenly becomes important. And then that's since been, in my opinion, been in the doldrums for quite a while in the last 50 or so years. Architecture, I think it's been stuck for about 100 years. I do believe that socially it was required to have this mantra, this modernist mantra going on all the time. But it's been stuck largely because it is cheaper to build and it's quicker to build in a sort of rectilinear form. But it's not necessarily as relevant as it was back at the beginning of the 20th century. So I think it has been stuck. But obviously with the current climate, literally and metaphorically, you have got a change in the air. First of all, I've already mentioned the environmental arguments. I think something's got to change architecturally to respond to that. And certainly clients have got to respond, I think, to do with the well-being. But obviously with the latest stuff, with the virus and so forth, that's changing behavior hugely. And so that will have a knock-on effect through to architecture and repurposing buildings. And we know offices are going to be totally changed. The way people work and the way people live and work together will be different. And that's going to change that. Lots of different sectors. We're seeing that in London at the moment. We've got a presentation called Hidden Spaces. Well, spaces are changing all over the place. The car is almost... Well, we're definitely out of favour in London. So we have a client who's got multi-storey car parks that go, some of which are 9 stories down in the ground in the middle of London, and they want to change them from car parks to something completely different, dark hotels or even logistics hubs. So it's a sort of, it's a practical thing that's changing, which might force architects away from this traditional sort of modernist mantra, which has been going on for 100 years. I think practical things such as the environment and such as the virus will push things in a different direction. And hopefully a new generation of architects will take up that and change things towards human beings, towards human nature, which I keep whacking on about.
You mentioned that there were limited projects that you could say where you had the creative freedom to express some of the ideas that you're interested in and that you believe architecture should begin to explore. If you could design anything for anyone, what would that be, or who would that be for?
I think it would be for me. I mean, it's not because I'm sort of some sort of self-centered egomaniac type of idea. It's simply because you have more control over what you think is right and what you'd love to do. And it wouldn't be actually for me. What I'm sort of saying is I'd like to be in control of it because I trust what I'm doing and I have a particular idea, and I feel I really have a desire to do something before I hang my hat up, so to speak. For instance, the Dunsfold project, we are looking at changing that to benefit other people. But if I wasn't in control of that project, I know that I would get tripped up somewhere along the line. These days, there are so many people involved in the process that no matter how good the idea is at the beginning, it's like a sort of ice cube. It starts off, with the best of intentions. Even the clients are often keen on it. But as soon as you start getting stakeholders involved, or you start getting costs or time or whatever, it slowly melts and you end up with something that is is a fifth of what you had before. And the other issue, which I haven't really mentioned, is how many projects do architects start and aren't completed? I could imagine it's about, 2 or 3% actually get through. And even if they do, are they what you originally thought? So answer the question, I would like to do something for me, for other people, because I do believe I or we could produce something which would be a benefit to a lot of different people, but without having to have somebody else saying what to do. After all, we've all learnt our craft over 7 years, and then since then another 20 or 30 years. It's a bit of a slow burning profession, but you do get to a sweet spot, I think, and that's when you should start deploying what you've got. And there aren't many places or many professions where you get so many people having an influence and putting in their four penneth, sometimes completely unqualified, and you just think, you just give up. I mean, the whole issue is in the hands often of people who aren't really able to have an opinion. And I know that sounds arrogant. Obviously, there are lots of people you put into the equation who do, but there are just too many people involved. At some point, to get something really, truly decent, there should be some sort of autocracy, some sort of coercion going on. Otherwise, you just end up with a sort of committee-led building, which is more or less what happens every time in the UK, at least. You get so many different ideas and opinions that to navigate through all that lot and preserve what you originally thought is quite a task. So for me, it would be for somebody else, but I would have at least hold of purse strings and at least hold of the program, go from there.
Now, based on this project that we envisage and also from your past projects that you've been a part of, how would you describe your working process, and what was that like on your most satisfying projects?
Years ago, like a lot of architects, I think you get an idea in your head straight away and you start drawing if you're not careful. And I've come round to the idea that you really have to get as much of the research done and as much information down as possible before you even think about pulling the pen out. Call it the sort of ammunition dump of information. And this is the really joyous part of architecture for me, is where you spend a lot of time with that sort of rigor, where you're getting precedent, you're understanding people, you're talking to other groups around the project, you're getting the hang of what everybody wants. But then you put everything in the middle of the table, if you like, and you get some really clever, interesting, imaginative people from all walks of life, whether they're within the practice or outside, or whether they've got anything to do with the project or not. And you have a brilliant session of, there's all the information, now what are we going to do? And you get this ammunition dump of information. Somewhere along the line, from sometimes some of the most unlikely quarters, you will get a spark of information, of an idea, which sets the whole thing off. And I think in that way, you avoid that horrendous project which sets off at slightly the wrong angle. And the further you go along the process, the bigger the angle gets. And you start thinking, oh God, we set off at the wrong angle. If you do that first bit properly, that it's an intelligent way to do it, obviously. You don't jump to a conclusion, and then you get a situation where there's a story to be told. You've got all this information, you've got a spark, the story starts off on the right leg, and then when you're standing up in front of the local authority and somebody says, I'm sorry, I don't like it, you can at least explain how you got there, and it all works famously, hopefully.
And let's go back into what you were discussing with relation to how the architectural industry as a whole has really, you could say, stagnated in its creative process. What other concerns or worries do you have about the industry and architectural practice?
I think it's the position of the architect, actually. In these difficult times, we as a profession, we've all done it. We will do more or less anything for nothing. It's beginning to erode our position in the team as well as our fees. So I find the lack of respect within the profession for architects across the building industry, is a big issue. I'm sure older architects, or perhaps they're not around anymore because it's that long ago, but architects were often seen as the leader of the team and were respected and welcomed on site and welcomed to meetings. I think a lot of clients see the architect as a sort of necessary evil. And I think our position in the building team or the design team has been eroded because we've allowed, first of all, fees to go down. Therefore, we're not valued as much as we should be. So that's an area of concern. And I know it's an area of concern for most architects. Our position there is not as it should have been. So there's a bit of a change there. But there are a number of sort of bits of high ground that we could take to ensure that we are at least central to the design development of any project, one of which is the environmental issue, the well-being issue, that we should make that our own and make sure that is inherent in all our designs, and therefore we become slightly more integral to the process rather than just an add-on if we're not careful.
So you think that sustainability could be one approach, but are there any other solutions or ways forward to hopefully stop this in its track, what you were explaining, the oversight of architects within the project teams?
Well, the interesting one actually is going back to the human spirit, human nature. If you could analyze human nature and human spirit in a sort of more scientific way, and a lot of people in the building industry are really only turned on by facts and figures. If you could say, if my architect designs this building in such a way, I will benefit from that as a developer, for instance. I will get more people coming through the door. I'll get more people staying there. I'll have more people staying there longer, so they'll buy more stuff. If you could actually put that together in a digital way or an analytical way and analyze almost the human reaction to a sort of digital twinning thing, which I know you're interested in. It's a sort of, you can analyze, I'm sure you can analyze human behavior and prove that certain colors are beneficial. Obviously, that's been done quite regularly, but actually people's reaction to spaces and the environments that we create, and then prove to somebody that an enjoyable space is a valuable space. We did Greenwich years ago, the supermarket at Greenwich. We got onto the Sterling Prize shortlist, and it had daylight for the first time. Well, not for the first time, but one of the first supermarkets to have daylight, north lit roof coming in, and the dwell time in that place went up because people were happy to be in that quite big space with daylight coming in, which meant they stayed there longer, spent more money, and actually had a better vision or feeling when they thought about the store, so they'd come back. That's quite difficult to prove to the money men and the people who are putting a program together, but it is actually quite an important issue to get the human nature bit right and to prove it. So to prove it, you would need some of these specialist tools to actually analyze how human beings react to certain spaces. And that is now possible. And I think we should be pushing that at long last. We have some way of proving it. That's great for me.
So a more empirical approach actually to the decision. Yeah.
Yes, it's a bit of an anathema, isn't it? Because you can talk about the art and the fluffy side of it all with instinct and a natural way of designing, but you still have to prove that works. So the mixture of art and science, which was always connected until the French decided to divide it up, is actually quite essential. It goes, hand in glove there to have something that's lovely, but you can prove that it's lovely for a reason and it works, is a great opportunity for everybody. And that's something I think could change.
And so finally, for aspiring architects or designers or let's say creative people or innovators, what advice would you give to them when choosing to enter the field and choosing to make an impact in their fields or their careers?
Well, it's a bit like the ammunition thing I mentioned before. Really think about whether you are an architect or not before you get into it, because and it does offer opportunities for different types of architects. I wouldn't say that. If you're looking to take the traditional route, which is a creative person who understands how things are put together and there's a mixture of art and science, I think you still have to say to yourself, is this actually me? Have I got a creative bone in my body? I've done a bit of examining up and down the country at a couple of universities, and you do wonder why some people have decided to become architects. It's a lovely idea. Most people, as far as I can make out, have considered becoming an architect at some point in their early careers, and it's got a good reputation. It's got a good pedigree almost. It's not quite as easy as it sounds in terms of for anybody coming in. I think it's not, I don't know. I just decry the fact that people don't necessarily go into it for the right reasons. But if you're in it, I would be, and I would be pushing probably harder if I could go through it all again, if you like, for standing by my own beliefs and starving for my art and doing only the things that I truly believed in. And I think the time is really ripe for somebody to change the direction of architecture at the moment. It's, as I said throughout this lecture, it's been a sort of this approach has been around for years and years. It's time for a change. So the encouraging thing is really stick your neck out and go for it, because there aren't big names coming through. They don't have to be big names, but there's not a movement coming through that changes what we've always done. And I think that the ingredients are all there. It's the right time. You got the happiness and well-being. You got the environmental side. I think decoration, color, all those things that appeal to the human spirit have been ignored for so long. If you picked up some of these threads and really pushed it hard as a young architect, I think you could start to make a difference. And that's what I would recommend if you do make the disastrous step of becoming an architect. That's not quite. If you do make a well-considered step of becoming an architect, there's, it's a great time to do that. If you were in the middle of the 50s, not much of a chance, but now, definitely.
So where could our listeners now find out more about your work and some of the resources of what you explained with Butterfly House and other exciting projects?
Well, I think the best route, probably the pure stuff that I've been trying to get across is on an Instagram account, which is just under my name, Laurie Chetwood. So that's I think it's a pretty good site to have a look at, and you'll get the essence. There's a sort of mixture of art, science, architecture, and it sort of does truly give or put across what I've been talking about today. That's probably the best one. We do have, obviously, Chetwood's website. That's going to be more commercial. There is an element in there of under studio of art and art and science mixture. So that's probably the best thing. I mean, if you put the name onto the internet, you get a few other things like some of the gardens we've designed and so forth. So that's probably the best place to find it all.
Thank you for tuning in to listen to BeyondBIM Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more from our latest episodes, then you can visit BeyondBIM, which is available on SoundCloud and iTunes and all the other major podcast providers.